Hello, everybody, and it's great to be here with everyone in this, what we expect to be an amazing session. My name is Lucica Dițiu. I am the Executive Director of the Stop TB Partnership, and together with my co-chair, Glenda, we have a big pleasure of having an amazing panel and lineup of great speakers for our session today. We are trying to really bring into light the impact that COVID has on TB research and development and access. And we will have a session with several speakers in trying to highlight in the dramatic way in which COVID-19 impacted research programs, affected communities, affected people with TB, as well as the global access to innovations movement. So this session will look over several ways in which COVID-19 is affecting the global response to TB, as well as how COVID-19 is actually benefiting from the decades of investments on TB and in providing and creating tools that now can be extended for their use into COVID-19. We will have at the end something that I think will excite all of us. Grania will go with us through an exercise of imagination, where we might be, in the response if we had fully funded global fight for TB as well as for COVID. Before I pass over to my co-chair, Glenda, I would like to encourage everyone to post in the conference platform in the questions, their questions, and myself and Glenda will make sure that it will be answered at the end. So stay with us. We will have a generous time at the end for questions and answers. Glenda, over to you.
Thanks, Lucia, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's wonderful to see you, even though we are talking virtually. It's my great honor to introduce 5 speakers. The first speaker will be Frank Kobelens, who will be talking about COVID-19 and TB research. He's from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Followed by Mudika Pai, who will talk about COVID-19 and access to TB tools from Montreal, Canada. And then Debshri Lokhanda from India, who will be talking about COVID-19 and TB survivors. And then Suraj Maduri from the United States, who will talk about COVID-19 and access to TB innovations. And last but not least, our comrade Grania Brigden from Geneva, Switzerland, who will talk about COVID-19 in a parallel universe with adequate funding for TB and R&D. What a wonderful world that'll be, Grania. So I'm going to say over to the presentations, and we will now go and listen to them in the virtual session. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to present on COVID-19 and TB research. It is obvious that there is a major need for tuberculosis research. If we are going to achieve the global TB strategy targets, we need to do more than just apply the tools that we already have. We need new tools, and for that we need a lot of research. COVID-19 obviously is impacting on that research, mostly in a negative sense, but to some extent, as we will see, perhaps also positive. I will try to address this by answering these 3 questions. How is TB research being affected by COVID-19? What is the COVID-19 response gaining from TB research? And how could TB research benefit from research efforts around COVID-19? I asked a number of researchers, mainly in the field of diagnostics, to give me some notes from the field, some things that there are challenges that they're confronted with. I'm not going to read them all. They probably also apply to vaccine research, to operations research, to drug trials. But what I will do, I hope you'll be able to see some of it, is to summarize them here in 4 categories. The TB research is being affected by COVID-19 through the safety precautions that are needed to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infections, by diversion of staff, infrastructure and resources, by effects of lockdowns, and by clinical interactions between the 2 infections. So with regard to safety precautions, what we see is that enrollment of patients is being put on hold. We see that study visits are being put on hold. We see suspension of procedures that are considered risky, such as sputum induction. And we see increased social stigma and discrimination of patients who are suspected of having COVID-19 infection. With regard to diversion of staff, infrastructure, and resources, we see testing capacity being diverted to COVID-19. We see researchers being pulled to COVID-19, first of all, because there is a need to, but second, also because funding streams are being diverted. And we see that regulatory and ethics capacity is getting flooded by COVID-19 applications, leading to delays in approvals of TB research proposals and protocols. We see effects of lockdowns, for example, in drops in TB notification affecting study enrollment, in disruption of home visits, in quality monitoring of trials being upheld, in disruption of community engagement, disruption of supplies, and in transport disruptions, for example, in the international export of samples, which may be a problem in multi-country studies that rely on centralized testing. And we see clinical interactions, common symptoms between COVID-19 and tuberculosis, common risk factors between the two diseases, including socioeconomic status and diabetes, higher death rates in TB COVID-19 co-infection, and studies have shown that TB patients who have COVID-19 infections have a poor recovery due to long-term respiratory disability. Collectively, these are the impacts and potential consequences. Study timelines are not met, leading to delayed achievement of TB goals. Studies are not reaching intended sample sizes, potentially leading to evidence in the end being considered as insufficient, so having effect on policy decisions. Patients interrupting treatment in trials, which poses a risk to their outcomes. Laboratory monitoring trials being interrupted, which affects patient safety and study results. And studies being put on hold altogether, leading to waste of resources and disruption of routine TB services. Now, with regard to the second question, what is the COVID-19 response gaining from TB research? There are 4 areas that I identified. First is knowledge. Second is innovation and platforms. The third, research infrastructure. And the fourth, potentially, interventions. So let's look at knowledge. There are a number of examples where knowledge that has been generated by TB research can be put to use and is being put to use for COVID-19 research. One example is aerobiology. There have been a lot of recent developments in aerobiology of TB transmission that are relevant and are being used for COVID-19 research. This also relates to a lot of studies that have been done, especially operational studies have been done in hospital infection control, from which COVID-19 response can benefit. TB research has done a lot in transmission dynamics of tuberculosis and in contact tracing, which is also of potential relevance, and I think is also being used currently already for COVID-19 response. And then there have been a number of findings in basic immunology that can be applied to COVID immunology as well. There have been innovations and platforms developed in TB research that are of relevance for COVID-19. One example is measurement of infectiousness. You see here an FFP2 mask that has been fitted with special filter that is being used to quantify the amount of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that is exhaled. And the same is now being applied for COVID-19 for SARS-CoV-2. Another example is AI-based imaging. Computer-assisted reading of chest X-rays has for a long time been developed and used in tuberculosis and is now also being used for diagnosis of COVID-19 using CT scans. Another obvious example is diagnostic platforms. For example, the Gene Expert platform, which has a lot of experience in tuberculosis. And then finally, a number of vaccine platforms have been exploiting TB that are now being put to use in COVID-19. There have been large investments over the past 10, 20 years in research infrastructure for tuberculosis research, especially in low middle income countries. And that is now being put to use for COVID-19 research as well. For example, research and clinical expertise, laboratories and laboratory networks, laboratory techniques, for example, sequencing, clinical trial sites and trial networks, operational and epidemiological research capacity, and community advisory boards. And then finally, potentially interventions. You're probably all aware of the trials that are ongoing of BCG vaccine to see whether that can mitigate severe SARS-CoV-2 infections. And if that holds true, then the live-attenuated TB vaccine candidates such as VPM-1002 and MTB-VAC could potentially have similar results. The third question, the final question, how could TB research benefit from research efforts around COVID-19? 3 areas, I believe: open science, accelerating clinical development, and increasing funding. The most obvious one that we see sort of most clearly at the moment is for open science. We see a surge in open access publications, preprint servers, open data sharing, a lot of science podcasts that are very useful, and especially the combination of getting used to doing online seminars and conferencing and low-cost online meeting platforms I think is a tremendous, it gives a tremendous advance in access, especially for researchers in low and middle income countries to be research. And just one example of that is the fact that several of you are now attending this conference for only 50 or 100 euro, whereas last year you would probably have paid somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 euro just to get there, to be there and follow the conference. So I think that is a real great benefit. There is potential benefit for what we now see in the acceleration of clinical development. We see accelerated early development of vaccines and drugs for COVID. We see quick decisions to move to phase 3, expanded clinical trial capacity, accelerated regulatory procedures, and advanced procurement and/or market commitments. Now, not all of this is positive. For example, the accelerated clinical development may actually in the end pose problems with regard to safety, and advanced procurement agreements may have negative effects on the availability in the end and the access to vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines in resource-poor settings. But on the whole, I think these are very important developments for which we could potentially benefit and speed up development in tuberculosis. And then finally, for funding, we see unprecedented governmental funding pledges. We see novel funding mechanisms. And I think very important, we see at the level of various governments, we see an awareness that major health threats are economic threats. And I think that together, these are very important developments that the TB research field could benefit from as well. So in conclusion, there's massive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on TB research due to safety precautions, lockdowns, diversion of resources and clinical interactions. This is likely to lead to delayed achievement of TB goals, evidence considered insufficient, risk to patient outcomes, patient safety and study results, as well as waste of resources and disruption of routine TB services. The COVID-19 response is gaining from knowledge, innovations and platforms resulting from TB research, from research infrastructure built by or for TB research, and potentially from TB interventions. And finally, TB research could benefit from elements of the open science, accelerated clinical development and funding that are realized in the research response to COVID-19. And finally, with these acknowledgements, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Hi, my name is Madhu Pai. I'm the director of the McGill International TB Center in Montreal, Canada. I have no conflicts of interest to report. So I think a key question that all of us are concerned about in this pandemic is how exactly is COVID-19 disrupting TB services, especially in high-burden countries. I was pleased that several civil society groups in TB joined together to do this large survey that was released recently in September on the impact of COVID-19 on the TB epidemic. Next slide. So what this shows is tremendous disruption of TB services, incredible levels of disruption of TB services. So lots of people with TB are currently either not able to seek care, or if they do seek care, they find the services not available. Notifications are plummeting downwards in many places, and it's not a temporary phenomenon for a few weeks. The impact of lockdowns and restrictions are continuing to echo well past the 6-month period. And there's also rising anxiety about TB funds being diverted away from tuberculosis. Next slide. So in many countries, we are now seeing that the public sector is completely swamped with COVID-19, while the private health sector in some places has collapsed. It has shrunk in number of providers. It's become more expensive or becoming more expensive and harder to access. So this really puts TB patients in a very difficult situation. They're anxious to go to a public center because they're worried about getting COVID, and they are struggling to access private sector because it's harder to access and more expensive. And patients are clearly deferring care seeking. They are rather wait it out, thinking it's a cough that will go away. Labs are giving less and less priority to TB testing in this crisis, and that's because many of the labs are being increasingly repurposed to run COVID tests. And TB notifications are dramatically dropping, and there's also data showing that TB completion and follow-up is suffering. People are not able to get their medicines or continue their TB treatment. Next slide. So India is a good case study as the highest TB burden country in the world. And data from both India's NICSHI system, the routine TB notification system, shows a precipitous drop compared to the previous months of the previous year. And again, the National Health Mission data also show TB treatment completion is also dipping in India. So India alone may have missed more than 500,000 people with TB during the first 6 months of this year compared to last year. Next slide. And many health facilities and programs are adapting in terms of what they can do to deal with this crisis. For example, researchers are saying that they are trying to repurpose their TB research program to deal with COVID-19. Some adaptation or the other is being done, for example, online consultation or sending medicines home or contacting patients through WhatsApp or call centers or digital adherence technologies and so on and so forth. So people are trying to adapt as best as they can. Next slide. So here are some integration issues that I like to focus on. Thankfully, there are tools that we in TB are using or have been using for a long time, which potentially could be dually used for both COVID-19 and TB. For example, there are digital X-ray systems with AI-based algorithms. Companies like Cure AI have developed it for both TB as well as COVID-19. Obviously, the COVID-19 AI algorithm needs to be validated, but if it is validated and shown to be useful, could we use X-rays for both conditions? Molecular tests that are now WHO approved, both the TrueNat system from India and the Gene Expert system by Cepheid, they have chips or cartridges for both COVID-19 and TB, and finding a way to integrate them and run both so that TB does not suffer could be an interesting strategy for all of us to consider. Next slide. So here, treatment support services can also benefit from some of the technologies that TB has been using or TB has pioneered. For example, call centers could be used to check and help support patients with both diseases. Video DOT, digital adherence technologies, family-based care, SMS reminders, they are all systems that are not, they're agnostic to the disease and can therefore be used for both COVID-19 and TB. Next slide. And obviously, we have invested, the TB systems have invested in people and systems for many, many, many years. For example, we work with community health workers. We have DOT supporters in many countries. We have outreach workers, TB delivery, contact tracers. All of them could potentially be used to help with both COVID-19 contact tracing and TB outreach for both conditions. Sending medicines home could be done for all conditions, not just TB. Next slide. So I want to kind of end with a few big concerns or caveats that I'm worried about. Although I see great potential to repurpose or use existing technologies for both diseases, I also remain concerned that all companies in this crisis are fully COVIDized. They're dealing with a great demand for COVID products, whether it's tests or drugs. And we know India is the world's pharmacy. And therefore, if India doesn't manufacture enough anti-TB medicines, first line and second line, I'm worried we might see drug and test stockouts in the coming year. And then, of course, TB R&D is delayed, TB trials are delayed, and that is not good news for us in the TB field because everybody is working on COVID R&D right now. And then, of course, the bigger concern is as the economies continue to suffer in the biggest recession since World War II, will TB funding suffer in the future? Donor funding in particular, will high-income countries continue to live up to their global health obligations is a big source of anxiety. Next slide. So diversion of TB talent is another concern that we should talk about. On one hand, it makes sense that TB researchers will pivot to working on COVID-19 because we are experts in respiratory infections and therefore we know what to do and we are better placed than most people. But on the other hand, if most of us divert our talents and our expertise and resources to doing COVID research, what happens to TB research is a concern that I have. So I'm hoping that at least some of us will stay focused on TB like designated drivers. We do have colleagues who will temporarily pivot to dealing with COVID-19, but I'm really hoping that some of us will stay focused on our primary mission so that TB fund research and R&D does not completely drop off the cliff. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, I'm Debashree Lokhande, an ex-DRTB survivor, patient advocate and fellow with Survivors Against TB India. I thank the entire Union World Conference team for making possible a virtual international conference. This session is about the impact of COVID-19 on TB research, development and access. It's a two-way street. And I am here to voice my experience as a TB survivor, drawing upon not only my own, but also an experience of being a guide to TB patients today. The major challenges as a TB survivor are reduced lung capacity. As pulmonary TB patients and survivors, we are already pushing through our days with increased breathing problems, and these affect our physical and mental stress, to add to which the worry that COVID-19 affects the lungs. The second, TB treatment and side effects. Toxic TB treatment causes many side effects, which in my case, I lost my hearing to kanamycin injections which were given as salvage therapy. My hearing is now aided with cochlear implants. This is a very common side effect about which I still counsel many TB patients. The worries and stress increased considerably when the world shifted to a virtual platform, including doctor's appointments. So patients who had hearing difficulties did not always have aids such as subtitles available for them to access healthcare. Long-term impact. Though I have defeated TB 4 years ago, I still face the stigma it carries, right from small things like the words used to describe TB survivors as someone with compromised immunity or weaker people, or infectious diseases somehow always being the patient's fault. The endless blame game. All these things add to the mental stress and burden of a TB patient. This stigmatizing perspective can possibly prevent them from accessing timely health care. Anxiety and fear with TB and now with COVID-19. The constant, heaviest challenge being a TB survivor. Grappling with it for 7.5 years, the fear has never really gone. But this year, COVID-19 has disproportionately caused anxiety, fear, stress, despair, and depression amongst us TB survivors and patients. The challenges in COVID-19 mainly are an infodemic with too much information, not all information verified or useful. This causes considerable confusion amongst TB patients, their caregivers, family, and the general public. Panic and misinformation, these leading to stigma, mental stress, and mental health issues. These might stop patients from approaching healthcare systems and accessing them. Isolation and anxiety. As the world shifted into lockdown modes, these led to isolation and mental anxiety, all costing the mental health infrastructure of our nation. Economic and job insecurity. These months have been hard for not only marginalized societies but also job insecure people. Why were you waiting? We are going to. Patients approach survivors against TB with service disruption, stigma, mental health, and economic challenges. Most do not have access to peer support. The opportunities in COVID-19 situation. Create a comprehensive multi-channel engagement program. Open all communication channels. Create a focused patient and community education programs addressing information gaps. Ensure addressing disruption gaps. Invest in new technologies and self-care systems. Invest in research and development for newer drugs and diagnostics. And to ensure policies for dissemination for enabling easier access to all these new research. Optimize systems to ensure those on treatment receive medication uninterrupted. Ensure patients and survivors are provided mental health counseling to reduce anxiety, reduce stigma through social interventions, and support both patients and survivors in managing their nutrition to ensure good, healthy, and immunity. How we at Survivors Against TB have supported and will continue to support communities. We have launched a virtual help desk to address patient concerns and link to services, community education, a multilingual patient education program touching upon important issues like wearing a mask, social distancing, etc., ensuring nutrition through government support and fundraising. Mental health support, peer guided and referrals when needed, peer support, offering information and counseling. And last but not the least, keeping myself and others safe, upbeat, and informed with accurate information. Let me close this presentation with the motto with which we work at Survivors Against TB: faith over fear. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Many thanks for the organizers for the opportunity to speak at this symposium. My name is Serge Midori, and I'm the US and Global Health Policy Director for Treatment Action Group. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So my talk today will focus on COVID-19 and the issue of access to innovations and public health technologies and how the current pandemic has changed the access landscape for many prospective TB innovations. The goal of my talk is to highlight some of the advocacy opportunities that are opening up. Before I even delve into the slides, let me preface this presentation by saying that there's an unprecedented political interest by policymakers towards public health in the context of this pandemic that has taken so many lives in such short time without an effective cure or vaccine. Even as this pandemic rages and the TB pandemic also rages as the world's leading infectious killer, so this shift in political and public and political tension can be an opportunity for activists and advocates in expanding access to TB innovation and ensure equitable access to the benefits of publicly funded science. First, it's important to at least come to a consensus on a few principles that are characteristics of the access to medicines or A2M movements. As governments, and in particular the US government, are committing large amounts of public resources to fund the tools we need to combat COVID-19, activists see this as an opportunity to coalesce on principles that frame accountability and equity in public policy. Some of these principles are recognizable as the core pillars of the A2M movement and derived from years of organizations and movements have advocated for unfettered access to critical life-saving drugs and are urgently pushing forward these principles on COVID-19. Starting with these principles are important because in a time where governments are blindsided by the public health crisis at the scale and speed of COVID-19, we cannot expect markets to solve public health problems quickly. We've seen this in TB. Government policies are being established at an equal breakneck speed to promote development and accountability in the access to new tools and are largely dependent on public funding. So it's important to note here that public funding that is being put towards COVID-19 is an important characteristic that TB also shares, in that public expenditures account for a significant amount of the total R&D spending for TB innovations. Therefore, the policy opportunities presented in COVID-19 could open the door for emerging TB innovations. Along with these principles, the policy ideas from the A2M movement is nothing new. If anything, these ideas are now appearing with more frequency in policy spaces because of COVID-19. We'll delve into some specific ways in which these policy innovations are appearing and that could potentially, what they potentially could mean for TB. These policy ideas are meant to level the playing field and provide much more ability to public funders, that is government, to leverage and hold product developers accountable to public access. Bad practices are also on the forefront and even under scrutiny, given the urgent need for innovations to quell the epidemic. Therefore, there's been considerable progress to recognize that the position that governments are in when they push funding out the door and they have no measures in policy to hold those investments accountable and safeguard the health of the public. It is also important to stress here that there's a temporal aspect to all these policies, in that policies need to be in place before innovations are marketed and by that point priced unfairly and unaffordable. So by putting these policies in place well before money goes out the door, access becomes an important requirement and contingency in the receipt of public funds, giving more power to the funder and to the taxpayers to hold developers accountable. So how has the access landscape changed in COVID-19? There's been a real remarkable slate of examples how the access landscape is shifting. So compulsory license has always been a bread and butter strategy to allow governments to exercise their ability to override patent rights as enshrined in international law. Now, compulsory license is now being seen as a policy strategy to counter inaccessible medicines. In early March, Israel's Minister of Health issued a compulsory license to allow for the importation of Kaletra for the purpose of treating patients with COVID-19, after the company, AbbVie, had failed to commit quantities. This forward-thinking step by the Israeli government has led to a domino effect, where many countries are considering ways to legislate compulsory licensing in health policies like Canada, Chile, and Ecuador. Other countries are also dusting off such policies, such as Australia, where the Crown Use Act is being used to ensure the supply of medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics. COVID-19 has also catalyzed and stood up new structures to enhance global coordination on R&D, strategically addressing accessibly early in the development phase. The COVID-19 technology pool, for example, ushered by the WHO and the government of Costa Rica, allows for governments to voluntarily share COVID-19 related health knowledge, data, and IP for the purposes of broad sharing of open science, which fulfills the right to science and the right to health. For transparency, I want to share two quick examples from the US context. As you know, the US government has pushed out unprecedented emergency funding to product developers via the CARES Act and other stimulus bills for a wide range of products for COVID-19, including therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics. The Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, or BARDA, has issued contracts with little provisions on accountability to large product developers. These include the gene expert manufacturer Cepheid. Given that many of these contracts are shrouded in secrecy and much product development occurs without disclosure of public investments and incentives that these firms receive, the resulting price setting is now coming under scrutiny. Two bills of which my organization has worked on are the TRACK Act and the MAP Act. These bills were introduced to provide accountability to public dollars. So these two bills are aimed at transparency, but also forcing accountability measures to be attached to publicly funded COVID-19 products. Lastly, incentivization. We should note that also bad policy ideas are also being recycled that can also complicate downstream access. I share these to be comprehensive, but also to urge that this is a time for activists and advocates to block and mitigate policies that extend patent rights and exclusivities. So how does TB innovation benefit with all this progress being made on the access landscape for COVID-19 innovations? Again, there's a temporal aspect to all of this. We have an unprecedented political opportunity in that governments are recognizing that they cannot conduct business as usual and therefore open to policy ideas on access and accountability. I can tell you from my own experience speaking with the most hardened conservative legislator offices that I was taken aback to hear them talk about transparency on product development with an eye to accessibilities. The two bills I referenced are bipartisan supported, which is something we've never seen before. The challenge here is that policies need to be reframed as not disease specific, but to also include other public health emergencies like TB. So policymakers are now halfway there in considering such access policies, but now it's up to the TB community to leverage this moment. Additionally, with countries opening their patent law around compulsory licensing to support the diffusion of innovations for COVID-19, this could be an opportunity to ensure that the same legal tools are applied to future TB innovations. The notion that we as taxpayers have funded the initial R&D of products is resonating in TB and heightened it in COVID-19. Also, so there's a shift in governments beginning to question who owns such products. TB products have historically received substantial public investment. At the time of this presentation, my colleagues at TAG have published 2 analyses on this fact on 2 key products, bedaquiline and GeneXpert. That said, this narrative is very receptive by policymakers now. And currently my organization has been using the US government-funded TB products as an example of why accessibility needs to be prioritized for future innovations that are also funded by public dollars. So on my last slide, COVID-19 has revealed significant global supply chain problems on essential products, which has been a characteristic of TB supply and market fragmentation issues. This graphic from the Organization for Cooperation of Economic Development posits that the policy needs to focus on the scaling up of manufacturing to ensure the supply of COVID-19 vaccines that can be deployed. These solutions might encompass more sharing of knowledge, domesticizing supply chains, driving multiple manufacturers, all of which can enhance access. So this is where policy needs to focus now. So as you know, we also have a promising vaccine candidates in the pipeline for TB. And this also may be the time to leverage the fact that the strengthening of supply chains and manufacturing could be applied to a new TB vaccine when it comes online. If we have robust infrastructure and capacity to manufacture volumes that meet demand for COVID-19, we could translate the same infrastructure to also be applied to an emergency like TB when a new vaccine becomes available. This goes to my last point. Agencies like BARDA and CEPI have played that role in strengthening manufacturing now for prospective TB innovations later. This is particularly a possible opportunity with BARDA, and technically through US law, BARDA is mandated to support TB and end-stage product development. So if we start focusing on agencies that are mandated already to work on TB, we can urge them to basically strengthen manufacturing for TB products later. Lastly, push and pull mechanisms are also being increasingly considered as models to spur R&D, but without a clear pull strategy. Some pull mechanisms are leading public health nationalism, where governments are putting substantial bets on firms to be the first in line or buying up existing supply of products that creates a shift in the market for low and middle income countries. But I share this because there's an important opportunity to elevate models like the Life Prize, which utilize pull and push and pull mechanisms as a conduit to get us to essential products that we need for TB, with a commitment to expanding access, while governments are looking for access guarantees and with their pocketbooks open to basically provide that funding. In conclusion, the access landscape continues to evolve, and there's a window for TB to leverage to maximize access to future innovations. It's really up to us as a community to not miss these opportunities and to make the vision of a world without TB even more clear. Thank you.
Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 in a parallel universe. What could have been achieved with adequate funding for TB R&D? First, to start with my conflict of interest, I have none to declare for today's talk. Today, I'm going to talk about a killer pathogen that is currently being reported globally, that is in every country in the world. It affects everyone who breathes, causes cough and fever, can lead to extended stays in hospital, long-term lung issues, and seems to adversely affect those who are vulnerable or those who congregate in overcrowded settings. The time has come to act. What can we do? Thankfully, we have some tools that we have been developed for this killer pathogen, and I think you've probably realized that I'm now actually talking about two, TB and COVID-19. TB has been around for millennia, whereas COVID-19 has been around for less than a year, or we've been aware of it for less than a year. But there is many overlaps, and there are potentially tools that we have developed for TB that could be used in our fight against COVID-19. These can include, and are not exclusive to, the BCG vaccine, PPE and infection prevention control measures, contact tracing, some of our similar diagnostic platforms such as the Cepheid platform, the TrueNet platform, the use of chest x-ray to diagnose, and treatment for the use of oxygen for those whose oxygen saturation levels are low. However, despite TB being around for thousands, if not millions of years, these tools we have that could help us in the fight against TB are not perfect. The BCG vaccine, we're still working out how to use it. The availability of PPE equipment and training in PPE and infection control is not widespread. Contact tracing is, again, not widespread. The Cepheid platform and the TrueNet platform are not a true point of care test. Chest x-rays are not widely available in low and middle income settings, and there are considerable challenges with interpreting them. And the same with oxygen. Its availability in many of the settings where TB is prevalent is not widespread. Now moving on to the BCG. In early March, there was a preprint ecological study which showed that the BCG may show a protective effect against COVID-19. This caused a flurry of media attention. Would it be the answer to the the COVID-19 vaccine? But unfortunately, we did not know because we have a number of great unknowns with regards to the BCG vaccination. BCG is one of our oldest vaccines and one of our most widely used vaccines. But due to the way it has been developed, there are many different cultures or strains of the BCG that have evolved, and it looks like these have different effectiveness against TB. Also, how the BCG vaccine works in different populations varies widely, with reasons that are still not widely understood, linking from geographical location, exposure to MTB or other non-tuberculous mycobacterium. In addition to its protective effect against TB, we also are learning that there are probably some cellular and molecular mechanisms that show that it can be protective against other diseases and other infections. It has been hypothesized that this is the induction of trained immunity, and really only in the last decade has any significant work into this trained immunity effect being taken place. And because of that, we're unable to confidently answer whether the BCG has any protective effects against the coronavirus or any, particularly this new COVID-19. So with this unknowns, we've had to start, or there has been a number of trials looking at the protective effect of BCG for COVID-19. These were all planned, started, ethical review, and funded within the space of a few weeks after the release of this ecological study. And they are indeed a fully global multinational trials. And how has this happened? Well, as we know, R&D costs money, and the investment and political will in finding a COVID vaccine has been overwhelming. If you look at what the US has invested in COVID vaccines to date, the US alone has invested $5.81 billion in the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. The European Investment Bank has invested another 400 million euros, and the European Union has committed to invest at least another 350 million euros into the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. Additionally, and specific to the role of BCG in COVID-19, there was a rapid mobilization of funds to support the multinational trials that are underway, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation continuing their support of vaccine development. How does this then compare to our TB vaccine. This is our TB vaccine pipeline. I'm going to pull out one particular example, and this is the M72 vaccine circled in red. So its phase 2 trial was registered on clinicaltrials.gov on 2012, with the first patients being enrolling in August 2014. The preliminary results from this phase 2 trial were announced just ahead of the UN high-level meeting in September 2018, with the full results being announced at last year's TB Science. This has shown that this vaccine has an efficacy rate of 54% and appears to be safe. So it is right for a phase 3 trial. We are now 12 months from the announcement of the full results of that trial, and the planning and funding for the phase 3 trial is still underway. So this vaccine continues to have delays to take forward its further development despite promising results. And this can probably be linked back to the investment. So if we compare to the $5.8 billion that has been mobilized in less than a year, last year there was only $109 million invested in TB R&D, with only 350 million over the last 3 years. This is less than one element of the European Bank that has been able to mobilize within a short period of time. And we see that with the vaccine pipeline, and if you can see here, we have the M72 vaccine is not our only vaccine in or approaching phase 3 trials, which are considerably more expensive. And with our current pipeline, we are not going to be able to move forward promising candidates unless there is a significant increase in R&D funding. So now I'm going to move to diagnosis. One of the platforms we use a lot in TB, and actually one of our rapid is the Cepheid platform, the main supplier of our rapid molecular tests. Cepheid in March got rapid FDA emergency use authorization for its SARS-CoV-2 test. I noted with interest that they mentioned that this was a point of care test, because I think us in TB are quite well aware of what exactly the Cepheid platforms mean by point of care test. And in fact, this is something that we have been working hard to ensure that this technology can be decentralized as far as possible. And it was with great fanfare that in 2015, Cepheid announced its Expert Omni platform, a small battery-operated platform that could take the expert test more to a point of care. 5 years later, we are now in 2020, there has been considerable delays in bringing this platform to market, and it is still not widely available. So again, we have delays in TB that could, and I think if this test was widely available, point of care, could that have helped the scale up and rollout of COVID testing? What can we think about the delays? And again, it's funding. The diagnostic funding for TB R&D is one of the least resourced compared to the needs of all the elements of TB R&D. Whereas, again, the COVID-19 investment in diagnostic tests, Silicon Valley investors have committed $1.3 billion towards COVID-19 diagnostic tests, and the NIH has invested nearly $300 million in technologies to address the challenges in COVID-19. So we're moving on to contact tracing, and I think you can see there is a pattern. Contact tracing is a cornerstone of how we respond to TB, and it has been ripe for advancement for new technologies, particularly mobile-based and app-based technologies. But in a review in 2016, there were only 24 apps that were found that could be used for TB contact tracing, but at least a third of these were not updated or not functional, and there were only peer-reviewed publications for 2 of those apps. As you can imagine, the COVID tracing apps, this is just a snapshot of the plethora of COVID-19 tracing apps that have been developed for screening for COVID-19. Essentially, even though TB and COVID have many similarities with regards to how they may be managed and the programmatic elements and some of the diagnostic tools that could help for diagnosing both of them, the investment in R&D has been considerably lower in TB. And I would like us to think about what had happened if we had invested, as the Stop TB Partnership had asked us to, and modelled out our $2 billion a year for TB. How many of these tools could have been available immediately in the global response for COVID-19? And this is just another highlighting of kind of the real challenge we face in TB R&D. So I pulled out the top 4 funders of TB R&D, so NIAID, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, NIH and USAID, and compared the funding that they have put into TB funding in 2018, the last data that we had from the TAG R&D report, and then the data that I've been able to find on their 2020 COVID-19 funding. And as you can see, we are looking at an incremental change in how much has been invested into COVID-19. The NIH number there, I think I put in red, is because it's really very unclear, because statements look like they've invested considerably more in that area. I would like us now to end on an inspirational quote, because isn't that what we're meant to be doing? As we sit in the darkness that is our killer pathogen, TB, I want us to imagine if we'd invested properly in TB R&D, if we knew exactly how the BCG worked and could have known sooner if it had any protective effect against coronaviruses in general, and maybe how it could have prevented COVID-19 in healthcare workers, that we had portable platform for rapid molecular tests that were widely available globally, particularly in high burden TB settings, and were truly a point of care test, that we had chest x-rays, again, that were widely available, portable, able to be decentralized with rapid access to interpretation of those chest x-rays, either from radiologists or using artificial intelligence technologies. If the availability of PPE and infection prevention control was widely implemented in all healthcare settings due to the knowledge and understanding of the benefits that could bring for TB. So I think if we'd invested in TB R&D, we could have brought a lot more to the COVID-19 response. But this does not mean we stop investing in TB R&D. I think it is vital that the investments that are made in COVID-19 R&D, do not mean that the investments in TB R&D drops, because TB is still a killer pathogen. It has still killed more people in the world than COVID-19 has. And I do hope that this investment in COVID-19 means that COVID-19 will not join the infectious disease Hall of Fame, and that it can be brought under control quickly and with no more loss of life. But also, as we invest in our COVID-19 technology, seeing the potential overlap, making sure that we bring that investment into the tools that can be used for helping our fight against TB. So with that, I would like to thank the Treatment Action Group for their annual R&D funding reports and pipeline reports that have been supporting my PowerPoint today. Yes, so thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hi, hello. And we really hope that everybody is here with us. And I would like to say that now we go to the real business because you can see all the amazing speakers here live and in different time zones, in different parts of the world. Thank you, Debshri, being with us a bit late for you. And we hope that you enjoy these great talks. You see, for some of you that are maybe not part of the TB community, what you heard from every single speaker today is the pain and the efforts that we did over the years to try and push TB research and the TB work in the countries at a level that will get us closer to ending TB. It's with great disappointment that we see a lot of these efforts derailed due to this entire pandemic. But also it is with great hope, as you heard from everyone, that we can maybe and probably do much more together if we are playing our cards in a smart way, to say so. We are very happy that we have several of you posting questions. We encourage you to do more. The first question comes from Karina, who I will send to our colleague Madhu as the chair of the PPM working group of Stop TB Partnership, looking at the private sector. Madhu, the question is, in countries with large private sectors treating TB patients, are we seeing an increase in recourse to the private sector for TB care? Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Luchika, and thank you, Karina. I think in countries like India, Indonesia, it's clear from the Global TB report that notifications are dropping in both public sector and private sector. In other words, patients are struggling to seek care in both sectors. And what I think we were hoping, at least some of us were hoping, that private sector will somehow take on a bigger role, because we always knew public sector will deal with a lot of COVID. And even as public sector is COVIDized, we thought private sector will kind of be the safety net. Turns out that private sector has been desperately hit in this pandemic. Many facilities are shut and gone broke because they cannot pay their workers for many, many weeks and months. Cost of care has shot up in the private health sector. because private health sector is seeing fewer clients, has to use PPE, all sorts of costs are being tagged on. And patients are now really in between a rock and a hard place. If they go to the public, they're scared of getting COVID, or they're worried that none of the non-COVID conditions will be adequately treated. If they go to private sector, they're dealing with the potentially shrunk sector that is more expensive and even exploitative in some places. So this leaves me very worried, because neither sector seems to be coming in to help in this crisis. In fact, all non-COVID diseases are absolutely getting hammered in many countries. So I just don't know what the solution is. And I keep wondering, if this continues like this, if I were an average patient, I'm scared to go to public, private sector is becoming expensive and difficult, where would I go? I think I'll end up going to the informal sector. I might go to pharmacies. I might go to my local traditional healers, because I'm not getting anything from anyone. And I don't know what the quality of care in that informal sector will be. If we know private sector care is either variable or low quality, and I'm really worried as to where the whole private sector story is going. We'll have to work exceptionally hard to bring back PPM to even where it was at the end of 2019.
I'm going to ask a question to Grania. Grania, a question was posed about the Life Prize and what the status is of the Life Prize. But I want to take it further than just the Life Prize. Where are we with innovative financing for TB R&D? And the Life Prize was posed as one thing, and I'd like you to give us a comment about the Life Prize, but also about either the lack of or the expansion of innovative financing for TB R&D. Thanks.
Thank you. So for those who maybe don't know, the Life Prize was work being done by the unions, Dr. U Partnership, MSF, and a number of other actors within the South African government to look at innovative ways of stimulating increased investment in R&D and really echoing and embedding the core principles that Sergey was mentioning around open data sharing, open IP access, and really trying to stimulate R&D by offering prizes and grants such that the cost of the end product was delinked or wasn't reflected by the cost of R&D, because the cost of R&D had been publicly financed. Now, this was work that was done a number of years ago, and I think this was in the pre-COVID era, where the idea of sharing the data, doing large collaborative trials with open access data, and really thinking innovatively about the role of IP in some cases stimulating R&D, but probably more frequently limiting R&D. It did not go as far as we would have hoped, but I think, as what Sergey say, that it's changed a lot. And I think the whole area of R&D, it has been realized that the current way we have been investing in R&D and thinking about R&D has left us wildly unprepared for diseases like COVID. And I think what my talk was trying to say is that TB has been something that isn't high income countries' problems. So it's a kind of afterthought. It's a corporate social responsibility investment. It's not a kind of airborne infectious disease that is present in every country in the world. It's never really been viewed like that. And I think there has been a sea change in how we think about how we invest in R&D. And I think coupled with that, there has been this realization that we need to be thinking about doing R&D in a way that the diseases that are not glamorous or that are not affecting London, New York, Washington, and Paris are still diseases that we need to focus on and we need to invest in. And in fact, maybe if we had invested more in some of these non-glamorous diseases, as I was trying to say, we could be ready for the future of pandemics a lot more. So There is a pan-TB network, and I don't know if any of the other speakers on the panels know more about that was launched earlier in the year, that is trying to look at ways of stimulating R&D into TB treatments, but I'm just not so sure if it's really quite there at the innovative financing and this really building on what COVID has shown us on the importance of making sure that publicly funded research results in publicly available data and IP. I just don't know the answer, so maybe others can add. Thank you.
Thank you, Grania. Our questions and answers section is getting very activated, so me and Glenda will have to be very strong with keeping the time. And I would like to ask Frank and Suraj to really reflect a bit on a question coming from our colleague called Rajaram Poti. And what he says is, if there was not too much research and development activities that were not happening for TB prior to COVID-19, how is this topic relevant in the COVID-19 scenario? And I think because we have a mixture of audience of people that are very much into TB and there are others that are more into respiratory health, I think it will be good to reflect a bit on this question. Thank you. Frank, maybe you go, and then Suraj.
Thank you, Lucica. I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but I have an answer nonetheless. So I think what we're seeing with COVID-19 research, I think that is going to benefit. That was not in my presentation. It's the other way around element. So I think the COVID-19 research is going to benefit tuberculosis research for a variety of reasons. For example, the fact that BCG, who had ever heard about BCG a year ago? Nobody knew that. They all thought it was the Boston Consulting Group. So now all of a sudden everybody knows about it. I think the whole idea of trained innate immunity, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but it's on everybody's radar screen, on every funder's radar screen. Innate immunity is probably key to understanding immunity in tuberculosis and key to development of an effective tuberculosis vaccine. So I think the TB world is really going to benefit from those innovations. The same will probably be true for vaccine platforms. There's a lot of different platforms. For example, the mucosal immunization route is being tried in COVID-19. There's potentially nasal immunization routes. Definitely the TB field is going to benefit from that as well. So I think that's very important. If we think about being strategic about funding, I think that what we see now is that governments are finally understanding that they have to invest in research and innovation for infectious diseases, which they had sort of stopped doing since the 1960s. And I think perhaps with a bit of exception for HIV. So I think that is another major development. If you look, for example, at the European Union, the EC President Ursula von der Leyen, less than a month ago, in her State of the Union, she announced that there will probably be a European BARDA. So there's going to be huge funding into this, into government funding into research and development for emergencies and infectious diseases. So I think this is something that the TB research will benefit from as well. Keeping in mind that for the EU, tuberculosis is a bigger problem than it is for the United States because of the MDR TB problem on their doorstep, and also because of the close link with sub-Saharan Africa. So I think that those are very important elements that we somehow have to be smart with regard to being able to tap into that strategically.
Thank you, Frank, for answering that question. He covered it really well, and I would only really add that, research is still ongoing for TB, but as Frank has presented in his presentation, there's a remarkable amount of impact of the COVID-19 epidemic on the trial enrollment and on ensuring that results will be released on time, on bringing drug supply to these countries in which clinical trials are occurring, things like that. And so there's definitely research that's still going on in TB, and it still needs to continue. And I think, to Frank's point around how TB research can benefit, I'm just going to also share within the chat for the session a recent brief that really does speak to a lot of what Frank was presenting on in terms of the cross benefits of TB research for COVID, and how, you know, this is a real opportunity given the fact that COVID-19 is seeing such an unprecedented amount of resources being devoted to trying to scale up, you know, vaccine development and therapeutics and things like that. That, you know, it's of no surprise that TB, and as a result of like TB research infrastructure and innovations in TB, that COVID-19 is benefiting. Another clear example of this is GeneXpert, right? The company Cepheid had developed a cartridge for SARS-CoV-2, and it utilizes the existing GeneXpert platform, which was actually developed through funding from the U.S. government, including the Department of Defense. And so in realizing that these investments that were originally going towards TB are now sort of cross-benefiting these COVID-19, it actually sort of creates the really strong message that we don't really necessarily have to recreate the wheel, that these historical investments in TB research can undoubtedly profoundly affect research for COVID-19. And therefore, we should really be investing even more significant funding into TB research, because COVID-19 will ultimately benefit. And not just COVID-19, we're talking about, you know, possibly other sort of emerging epidemics that might happen, you know, beyond COVID-19. So if we continue to make these investments in TB research, I really do think that the broader sort of global health, infectious disease sort of sector will really benefit in that sense. And I'll just share the brief, in the chat right now. And if folks have any questions about that, please feel free to reach out to Treatment Action Group. We love to see this being used in advocacy, because I think the messaging is really strong, but the opportunity is really sort of narrow, and we really need to take advantage of right now to ensure that we can tap into existing resources that Frank was saying around COVID-19 and bring it towards TB.
Glenda, we have Deb who wants very quickly to address this same question. So why don't you go ahead, Debshri, on the same question?
Hi, everyone. So the question regarding how research on TB or COVID is relevant and how it makes a difference. So I'm a TB survivor, and I'm alive today because of research in the TB sector, where there was a lot of research regarding the development of new drugs like bedaquiline and delamanid, and these are drugs which, I mean, even today a lot of patients don't have access to this. So it is absolutely important that there is continuous research going on.
Okay. I think you're...
And it is saving lives. So the same way with regards to COVID-19. Hello?
Your connection is a bit weak. So maybe we go to Glenda for the next question, and then you finish your thought, because I will have to ask you something coming up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Debbie. So I have a question. I have two questions that I want to expand on. In the chat box, there was the question about the BCG revaccination, and Frank, you mentioned something about it. And so I wanted to ask you what you thought, what the role was of BCG revaccination for the management of COVID infection. And that was one of the questions. So I would like you to respond to that. And then Suraj, I'm going to expand a little bit on your GeneXpert issue, and wanted to ask you whether having the same platform for COVID and TB for GeneXpert, would there be a issue around repurposing, and you might find yourself in a position that poor countries may reallocate resources and to COVID-19 diagnostics at the expense of TB diagnostics, and I wanted you just to comment on that. But Frank, first, if you could just talk about the BCG quickly about the BCG revaccination, and and then Suraj just to expand on the issue around gene expert and resource allocation.
Thank you for that question, Glenda. So I think BCG revaccination is nowadays called BCG revaccination because there was this one trial that showed that if you would give an adolescent who had been vaccinated birth BCG again, that it would reduce the risk of infection, tuberculosis infection. We don't know exactly what it means, by the way, in terms of protection, but that hopefully we'll know that later. I think with regard to COVID, obviously we don't know yet. I mean, all these trials are ongoing. I think there are the first trials are about to report their results, and there the question is really whether BCG can reduce severity, not so much infection. I think that is a long shot, but severity, because there are indications that our innate immunity, our innate immune response, and that's what BCG apparently acts on. Our innate immune response in the very early stages of infection is very important to mitigate severe infection. So it might actually help and it might actually work. And there is data from other respiratory infections in the elderly that shows that BCG vaccination in the elderly can reduce severe respiratory infection due to other viruses. Now, with regard to that specific question, could you slot in BCG TB infection in a trial for COVID-19? Probably not, because these trials have much shorter timelines and they have much smaller sample sizes, because COVID-19 incidence, at least in these trials, is expected to be much higher than tuberculosis incidence, even for tuberculosis infection. But you could probably do it the other way around. You could actually say, well, there will, I mean, even if this is shown to be effective, there will be a lot of additional questions around how BCG could potentially be used in practice to mitigate these effects of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2 infections. And then this might be actually a way to incentivize funders to invest in these TB trials, but because they can help addressing these COVID-19 questions as well, because these trials some of them are ongoing with new vaccine candidates. There is this BCG revaccination trial ongoing as well, but there are also other trials being planned. So I think there is a real opportunity there. I think that again requires strategic positioning of these opportunities towards funders.
Thanks. And Suraj, could we just quickly comment briefly, because we are going to start running out of time, but just briefly about resources.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that we are seeing is something that Frank had alluded to was advanced market commitments being made around, this pre-purchasing of these products. And what we're seeing is that U.S. government, for example, spent a lot of money on doing some pre-purchasing of those cartridges that Cepheid had allocated for SARS-CoV-2. And the problem with that right now is that as these sort of private sector companies get that money in the form of advanced market advanced market commitments, it's essentially shifting their kind of priority towards their manufacturing facilities to basically produce these SARS-CoV-2 cartridges versus TB. And so there is a real problem, especially as supply chains are disrupted and travel continues to be a challenge, of really trying to shift that allocation towards making sure that there's also enough supply of TB cartridges also being sent to low and middle income countries. I think that's going to be an ongoing issue, and which is why I think that part of what we need to do as activists is also be monitoring these policies around these advanced market commitments to be able to predict how they'll shift the market in many ways, and then force suppliers to make some decisions really based on business to basically stop production or limit production on products that might be aimed for TB, right? When we really need both at this point, and also priced fairly. I mean, the other issue to this also is that many of these products are publicly funded. And so, the Cepheid cartridge, for example, should not be priced at what it is now. It should be priced at $5. And it's also, too expensive for use in a lot of these middle income countries. And so that's another issue that I think is very important. I'll stop there because I know we're almost.
Thank you very much. And we move to our last question that we will answer live. And then there are a lot of questions that are there published. But I want to give a chance to Debshri to answer the question for her, because it's also a great initiative. And it's about the hotline, to say so, that is happening in India for TB survivors. Question asked from Kate. Can you go ahead, Debshri, and try in 2 minutes, 3 minutes to tell us about it?
Hi. So I work with an organization called Survivors Against TB India, and we launched a help desk, a virtual help desk, as well as an app called Talking TB. So a lot of patients from all over the country reach out to us on, Facebook or Instagram or ShareChat, etc. And so that the thing is, they see media about us survivors, and they feel like they can share their concerns with us. And through the platform, we have been able to address a lot of their concerns, especially in this period of COVID-19, where there were a lot of gaps in, and disruption in treatment patterns, and for them to access services, for them to access medication, for them to, get appointments or to get medical queries answered. So we were not only providing peer support to them, or counseling, or connecting them to specialists, but also us survivors were interacting with them daily. And that is how the platform, which is a chat platform, we also have calls. So it's a Talking TB app, which itself has been a very like a strong step. And I really hope that we can reach out to more people. We have been able to share a lot of media regarding the lives of survivors, not only during treatment, but even post-treatment. And these videos and messages really connect with patients at a very emotional level, and it provides support to them. So that is what Survivors Against TB has been doing, and we have had a great time, and I hope that we can reach out to more people. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. I think this was a great session. And it's time for us to say goodbye. Unfortunately, there was a big question overarching that was repeated in different ways that actually deserves a session in itself at the next union, hopefully in a different environment, which is what we can do as a TB community better, that we can capture the attention in the same way as COVID-19. There were some attempts of answers of this, and Madhu sent an article. Also, Suraj sent a few things from our colleagues in TAG that did a lot of research. Questions still coming, but unfortunately, we are not able to take them anymore. This was a great session that will close specifically in the connections in the next 3 minutes. I would like, on behalf of everyone, to thank all of those looking at us, all of us being with us, but also our amazing speakers with Debshri, Grania, Madhu, Frank, Suraj, and me and Glenda, as I said, from different parts of the world. I know we are finishing a bit early, but I would like to wave goodbye, all of us, to all of you. And hopefully, with all our efforts, we can do what we hope, all of us, ending TB by 2030. Thank you very much.